Secrets echo through the marble halls of the Romano estate. But the most dangerous truth belonged to the woman everyone ignored. Harper Evans weighed over 200 pounds, hiding behind a shapeless grey uniform. To the ruthless cartel boss Victor Romano, she was merely background noise, until the night he feigned unconsciousness to catch a traitor. The unbelievable actions she took beside his bed shattered his cold exterior completely, bringing the feared Don to absolute, silent tears. The Romano estate sat like a fortress of stone and glass on a jagged cliff overlooking the Hudson River. High iron gates, laced with razor wire and guarded by men armed with automatic rifles, kept the outside world entirely at bay. Inside, the mansion was a masterpiece of cold opulence. Massive chandeliers dripped with imported crystal, casting a sterile, unfeeling light over floors of polished black marble. To most, it was a palace of dreams. To the people who worked there, it was a beautifully decorated prison, ruled by a man whose reputation was carved in blood. Victor Romano was 34 years old, the undisputed head of the Romano syndicate. He had inherited the empire after his father's brutal assassination 5 years prior, and he had spent every day since ensuring nobody would ever dare attempt a similar coup. Victor possessed a chilling kind of handsome features: sharp jawline, piercing cobalt eyes that seemed to freeze the air in the room, and broad shoulders perfectly tailored into charcoal bespoke suits. He spoke softly, a deliberate choice that forced everyone around him to hold their breath to listen. He trusted absolutely nobody. Betrayal was the only currency he truly understood. Among the sprawling staff hired to maintain his fortress, Harper Evans was a ghost. Harper was 28, though the deep exhaustion etched into her soft, round face often made her look older. Standing 5 feet 6 inches and weighing well over 200 pounds, she was entirely accustomed to being the butt of cruel jokes. In a world that prized sharp edges and flawless beauty, Harper was a soft, silent mound of grey fabric, scrubbing the baseboards and polishing the mahogany banisters. The other maids, slim, ambitious women hoping to catch the eye of a wealthy capo, mocked her constantly. They called her the blimp, laughing behind their manicured hands as she struggled to carry heavy laundry baskets up the grand staircase. Harper never fought back. She absorbed their venom, just as she absorbed the pain of her reality. She was not working in this Mafia stronghold by choice. Her younger brother, Caleb, a foolish boy addicted to the thrill of high-stakes gambling, had racked up a massive debt with Arthur Rossi, Victor's ruthless underboss. To save Caleb from having his kneecaps shattered, Harper offered the only thing she had: her labor. She signed a contract binding her to the estate until the debt was paid, effectively selling herself into indentured servitude. Her weight had always been a shield. Growing up in a rough neighborhood, she learned early on that being invisible was the safest way to survive. She ate to numb the anxiety, building a literal wall of flesh between herself and a world that only sought to consume her. In the Romano estate, this invisibility served her well. The hardened criminals and sociopathic enforcers stalking the hallways never looked at her twice. They discussed multi-million-dollar drug shipments, political assassinations, and bribery right in front of her, entirely convinced she lacked the intellect or the courage to understand their words. But Harper saw everything. She saw how Arthur Rossi's eyes darted nervously whenever the Albanian cartel was mentioned. She saw how the head housekeeper, Evelyn Carter, a severely thin woman with eyes like a hawk, sneaked expensive bottles of vintage wine into her private quarters. Most importantly, Harper saw the truth about Victor Romano. The rest of the world saw a monster, a machine incapable of human emotion. Harper, quietly dusting the massive bookshelves in his private study, saw the man underneath the armor. She noticed the way his hands trembled slightly when he poured his evening scotch, betraying a deep, agonizing exhaustion. She observed the heavy, dark circles under his eyes, the physical manifestation of carrying the lives of hundreds of men on his shoulders. She saw him wince when he walked, hiding a bullet wound in his thigh he had sustained 3 months ago. While the others feared the Don, Harper simply felt a profound, aching pity for him. He was a king locked in a cage of his own making, surrounded by sycophants waiting for him to bleed. The tension in the estate reached a boiling point on a stormy Tuesday evening. Lightning cracked across the dark sky, illuminating the pouring rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Victor had just returned from a catastrophic meeting in the city. An ambush had taken place. 2 of his best men were dead, their blood still staining the cuffs of Victor's white dress shirt. Harper was in the kitchen, silently scrubbing a mountain of pots, when Evelyn Carter marched in. The head housekeeper's sharp heels clicked violently against the tiles. "Evans!" Evelyn snapped, her voice dripping with absolute disdain. "Leave those. The master's study needs a deep clean before morning. He tracked mud and God knows whose blood all over the Persian rug. Go!" Harper wiped her sudsy hands on her apron, her heavy chest heaving a quiet sigh. "Yes, Miss Carter." "And don't dawdle," Evelyn sneered, leaning in close, her breath smelling of stale smoke and peppermint. "Try to move faster than a dying walrus for once in your miserable life." Harper swallowed the lump in her throat, keeping her eyes fixed on the floor. She gathered her cleaning supplies and made her way toward the east wing, the most restricted area of the house. As she walked the long, dimly lit corridors, a deep sense of dread settled into her bones. The house felt different tonight. The air was thick, charged with the dangerous electricity of impending violence. Someone had set Victor up. Someone inside these very walls had leaked the location of his meeting to his enemies. Inside the study, the heavy oak doors were shut tight. Victor Romano stood alone by the massive fireplace, staring into the roaring flames. His knuckles were bruised, the skin split and bleeding. The physical pain was nothing compared to the cold realization gnawing at his mind. The ambush today had been too precise, too perfectly timed. Only a handful of people knew his exact route, and all of them lived under this roof. He had a mole, a rat feeding information to the Albanians, hoping to watch the Romano Empire crumble. He could not interrogate his guards. They were loyal only to strength, and showing paranoia would be perceived as a fatal weakness. He needed to find the traitor himself, quietly and definitively. Victor devised a ruthless test. He knew the house staff had unfettered access to his personal spaces. He also knew that greed was the most predictable human flaw. Moving with deliberate slowness, Victor approached his massive mahogany desk. He pulled out a black leather ledger, a decoy he had created months ago, filled with false bank routing numbers and fake lists of bribed politicians. He left it open on the desk, the pages practically screaming to be photographed or stolen. Next to it, he casually tossed 3 thick stacks of $100 bills, amounting to $30,000. Then Victor opened a small silver pillbox. Inside rested a potent muscle relaxant he occasionally used for his leg injury. He took 2 pills, double his normal dose. Within 20 minutes, the drug would paralyze his skeletal muscles, dropping his heart rate and making him appear completely unconscious, deeply asleep, or perhaps even dead. However, his mind would remain entirely awake, his hearing sharpened by adrenaline. He poured himself a glass of expensive bourbon, setting it on the side table next to his favorite leather wingback chair. He sat down, facing the desk, and waited for the drug to take hold. The storm raged outside. Thunder shook the heavy glass panes. Slowly, Victor felt his limbs grow incredibly heavy. A thick fog settled over his body, pinning him to the chair. His eyelids fluttered and closed. To anyone walking in, the feared Don Romano was completely passed out, vulnerable and defenseless. 20 minutes later, the door handle clicked. Victor's breathing was slow and shallow. He could not move his fingers, could not open his eyes, but he heard the soft, hesitant footsteps entering the room. He recognized the scent immediately, cheap lavender perfume. It was Jessica, one of the younger maids. He heard her gasp softly as she saw the money. Her footsteps rushed toward the desk. Victor's heart hammered against his ribs. Would she take it? He heard the rustle of paper. A long, agonizing pause stretched through the room. Then she whimpered softly, clearly terrified, and backed away. She rapidly dusted a nearby shelf and hurried out of the room, shutting the door behind her. Victor felt a tiny sliver of relief, but the test was far from over. 10 minutes passed. The door opened again. This time, the footsteps were sharp, authoritative, and completely devoid of hesitation. Click, clack, click, clack. Evelyn Carter. Victor focused all his energy on keeping his breathing perfectly steady. He smelled her peppermint breath as she leaned directly over him, checking to see if he was truly asleep. She even waved a hand inches from his face, testing his reflexes. He remained completely motionless. Satisfied he was out cold, Evelyn turned her attention to the desk. Victor heard the unmistakable sound of a smartphone camera, shutter clicking rapidly. She was photographing the decoy ledger. The ultimate betrayal. She was the rat. Anger, hot and venomous, flared in his chest, but his paralyzed body refused to move. He heard her shuffle the stacks of money, slipping several thick wads of bills into the pockets of her uniform. But then Evelyn did something that made Victor's blood run absolutely cold. She walked back to his side table. He heard the faint rustle of fabric, followed by the clink of glass against glass. "Rot in hell, you arrogant bastard," Evelyn whispered, her voice dripping with pure malice. He heard the distinct sound of liquid being poured into his bourbon glass. It was a subtle, soft splash. She was poisoning him. Evelyn turned and briskly walked out of the room, leaving the door slightly ajar. Panic, raw and suffocating, seized Victor's mind. The muscle relaxant held him firmly in its grip. He needed to knock the glass over, needed to push it away, but his arms felt like they were cast in solid lead. He managed to twitch his index finger, but it was useless. He was trapped inside his own body, entirely at the mercy of whoever entered the room next. When he eventually woke up from the sedative, he might instinctively reach for that drink out of sheer thirst, sealing his own fate. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked methodically, counting down the minutes of his life. Then heavy, slow footsteps approached the hallway. Harper pushed the heavy oak door completely open, carrying a wooden bucket filled with fresh cleaning supplies and a stack of clean towels. The dim light of the fireplace cast long, dancing shadows across the study. Immediately, she noticed Victor slumped in the leather chair. Her breath hitched. The formidable boss looked entirely defeated, his head tilted back, his face alarmingly pale in the firelight. She stepped into the room, moving quietly despite her size. Her eyes scanned the environment, noting the disarray. Then she saw the desk. The ledger was open. The stacks of cash were scattered, looking disorganized and significantly lighter than they should have been. To a woman struggling to pay off a Mafia debt that threatened her brother's life, that money was a miraculous ticket to absolute freedom. Just one of those stacks could buy her a new life far away from the cruelty of this estate. Victor, trapped behind his closed eyelids, waited for the inevitable. He recognized Harper's heavy tread. He knew her file. He knew she was desperate, impoverished, and treated horribly by his own staff. She had every reason in the world to steal the cash and run into the stormy night. He braced himself for the sound of her taking the money. Instead, Harper turned her back on the fortune entirely. She had noticed something else. Earlier that afternoon, while taking out the kitchen trash, Harper had seen Evelyn Carter standing near the perimeter fence, speaking in hushed tones with a man wearing a heavy raincoat. Harper had accidentally caught a glimpse of the man, handing Evelyn a small, dark glass vial. Evelyn had slipped it into her apron with a sinister smile. Now, standing in the study, Harper's sharp eyes landed on the bourbon glass resting on the side table. A faint, oily film swirled on the surface of the amber liquid. Harper's heart pounded violently against her ribs. She looked from the glass to Victor's pale, defenseless face, and then back to the desk. The pieces of the puzzle clicked together in her mind with terrifying clarity. Evelyn had been in here. Evelyn had taken the money and photographed the book. And Evelyn had left a parting gift. Victor listened intently. He heard Harper approach the table. This is it, he thought. She will take the money. She will leave me here to die, and the Romano Empire will burn to the ground. He felt a sudden shift in the air. Harper reached out and picked up the poisoned glass of bourbon. She did not hesitate. She walked directly to the roaring fireplace and poured the entire contents onto the burning logs. The flames hissed violently, flaring up in an unnatural, bright green hue for a brief second before settling back down. Victor's mind reeled. She had destroyed the poison. Harper set the empty glass back on the table. She stood over Victor, looking down at his bruised knuckles and the dried blood staining his collar. A profound wave of empathy washed over her. He was a terrifying man, a criminal mastermind. Yet in this very moment, he was just a broken, exhausted human being surrounded by vipers. Moving with extraordinary gentleness, Harper picked up a warm, damp cloth from her cleaning bucket. She leaned over him. Victor felt the sudden, shocking warmth of the cloth against his skin. Harper was carefully, tenderly wiping the dried blood from his jawline and his knuckles. Her touch was incredibly soft, devoid of the fear and trembling reverence everyone else displayed. They surround you with betrayal, Harper whispered into the quiet room, her voice a soothing, melodic hum that completely contrasted with her usual absolute silence. They take your money, they take your energy, and they try to take your life. She carefully adjusted his limp arm, resting it comfortably on the armrest. You build these massive walls of stone and violence to keep the monsters out, Mr. Romano, she continued softly, her fingers gently wiping a streak of dirt from his forehead. But you locked the real monsters inside with you. I see how tired you are. You carry the weight of an entire empire, and nobody ever stops to ask if your shoulders are aching. Victor's chest tightened painfully. No one had spoken to him with such raw, unfiltered honesty since his mother died 2 decades ago. Every woman he had ever known was drawn to his power, his money, or the dangerous thrill of his lifestyle. None of them had ever looked at the blood on his hands and simply tried to wash it away. Harper reached over and grabbed a heavy, luxurious wool blanket from the sofa. She unfolded it and draped it mirthfully over Victor's broad shoulders, tucking the edges around him to ward off the chill of the stormy night. You don't have to be the ruthless king every second of the day, Harper whispered, stepping back and looking at his peaceful face. "Even the devil deserves to sleep without keeping one eye open. You are safe right now. I won't let anyone hurt you." Underneath the heavy veil of the muscle relaxant, a powerful, uncontrollable emotion surged through Victor's chest. The absolute purity of her actions, the stunning realization that this woman, the one his staff mocked relentlessly, the one who owed him her very freedom, had just saved his life and offered him unconditional comfort, shattered the icy fortress guarding his heart. He could not move his body, but he could no longer control his physical reaction to the overwhelming gratitude and sorrow swelling inside him. A single hot tear escaped the corner of his closed eye, tracing a slow path down his bruised cheek. Harper gasped softly. She froze, her wide eyes staring at the moisture glistening on his face. She realized instantly that he was not fully asleep. He was trapped, and he had heard every single word she had spoken. Trembling slightly, Harper reached out one last time. With her thumb, she gently wiped the tear away from his skin. "Rest now, boss," she murmured softly. "The house is clean." Harper picked up her wooden bucket, completely ignoring the thousands of dollars still scattered across the desk, and quietly walked out of the study, pulling the heavy oak doors firmly shut behind her. Inside the silent room, the grandfather clock continued to tick. The fire crackled warmly. Slowly, agonizingly, the heavy paralysis gripping Victor's muscles began to fade. He twitched his fingers. He flexed his jaw. Victor Romano opened his eyes. The room was empty, but the scent of clean soap and the lingering warmth of the wool blanket draped over him remained. He looked at the empty glass on the table, then at the door where Harper had disappeared. The beast was fully awake, and he finally knew exactly who his enemies were. More importantly, he had just found the one person in his entire empire worthy of absolute trust. The grandfather clock chimed 2 a.m. Inside the study, Victor Romano tested his limbs, rolling his broad shoulders as the final remnants of the chemical paralysis dissolved into his bloodstream. He stood up slowly, bracing his hands against the mahogany desk. The sheer gravity of the night's revelations settled over him like a suffocating shroud. His empire was infested with rats, yet his savior was the very woman his entire staff treated like garbage. Victor stared at the fireplace, watching the last embers glow. He could still feel the phantom warmth of Harper's damp cloth against his bruised knuckles. He remembered the soft, steady rhythm of her voice, the profound empathy radiating from her heavy frame. She possessed no weapons, no money, and no formal power, yet she had completely dismantled his defenses with simple, pure kindness. There would be time to address Harper Evans later. Tonight, blood demanded a response. Victor reached for his secure satellite phone and dialed a heavily encrypted number. It rang precisely once. "Boss," a gruff voice answered. It belonged to Dominic Vargas, Victor's most lethal enforcer and childhood friend. Dominic was a mountain of a man, fiercely loyal and completely ruthless. "Bring a cleanup crew to the estate immediately," Victor commanded, his voice dead of any emotion. "And bring Michael Sullivan. We have an infestation." Within 30 minutes, the quiet estate transformed into a highly coordinated tactical zone. Black SUVs rolled silently up the winding driveway, their headlights extinguished. Armed men in tactical gear slipped through the shadows, neutralizing the compromised perimeter guards who had blindly allowed Evelyn Carter to meet with the Albanian contact. Victor stood in the grand foyer, his charcoal suit impeccably adjusted, completely erasing any trace of the vulnerable man from the study. He handed Dominic a piece of paper containing 3 strict directives. Immediate tactical orders. Detain the head housekeeper. Pull Evelyn Carter from her quarters quietly. Gag her before she can scream. Secure the decoy ledger. Confiscate her mobile phone and upload the encrypted tracking malware attached to the fake ledger photos she transmitted. Locate the underboss. Find Arthur Rossi's exact GPS coordinates. Prepare an extraction team. She is in the basement, Dominic reported quietly, 10 minutes later, handing Victor a silver tray containing Evelyn's smartphone and the thousands of dollars she had stolen from the desk. We secured the device. She already sent the photos to a burner number linked to the Albanians. The tracking protocol is live. We are getting their locations right now. Victor nodded slowly. He descended the stone stairs into the soundproof cellar normally reserved for storing vintage wines. Evelyn Carter was strapped to a heavy wooden chair under a single, glaring, fluorescent bulb. She wore a silk nightgown, her perfectly coiffed hair now a tangled, disheveled mess. When she saw Victor walk into the room, perfectly healthy and intensely awake, the remaining color drained completely from her sharp, thin face. She began to hyperventilate. "You poured a highly untraceable neurotoxin into my bourbon," Victor stated calmly, pulling up a chair and sitting directly across from her. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "A lethal dose designed to mimic a massive heart attack. It was a very clever plan, Evelyn." Tears of absolute terror streamed down Evelyn's face. She struggled against the zip ties biting into her wrists. "Mr. Romano, please, they forced me. Arthur Rossi told me they would kill my sister if I refused." Victor's cobalt eyes remained frozen. He felt no pity for the trembling woman before him. "You stole $30,000 from my desk, photographed my private ledger, and smiled while doing exactly as you were told. Greed motivated you, not fear. I know perfectly well how Arthur Rossi operates." "Please!" Evelyn shrieked, her voice echoing off the cold stone walls. "I will tell you everything, every single detail about their meeting tomorrow." "You will indeed tell Dominic every single detail," Victor replied, standing up and smoothing his tie. "But your employment here is permanently terminated, and so is your life in this city." He turned to Michael Sullivan, who stood quietly in the shadows. "When Dominic finishes the interrogation, drain her offshore bank accounts entirely. Take the money she stole and donate it to the city orphanage. Then drive her to the Canadian border. Leave her in the woods with no shoes, no jacket, and no identification. If she ever steps foot in New York again, shoot her." Victor walked back up the stairs, leaving Evelyn's frantic, muffled screams locked behind the heavy steel door. As he walked through the silent, dark corridors of the sleeping house, his thoughts immediately drifted back to the East Wing. He needed to find Harper. He needed to understand the heavy, quiet maid who had risking everything to pour out a poisoned drink. The morning sun broke through the heavy storm clouds, casting brilliant rays of light across the manicured lawns of the Romano estate. Inside the sprawling kitchens, the atmosphere was chaotic. Harper Evans stood by the massive industrial sink, scrubbing a heavily soiled roasting pan. Her uniform felt tighter than usual today, the cheap fabric digging uncomfortably into her sides. Her heart hammered a relentless rhythm against her ribs. Every time a door opened, she flinched. She kept waiting for the terrifying moment when Victor Romano's guards would drag her away. She had ruined his expensive carpet by pouring the drink into the fire. She had touched the Don without permission. In the Mafia world, such transgressions often resulted in severe punishment. "Did you hear?" Samantha, a slender maid with blonde hair and cruel eyes, whispered loudly to another girl across the counter. "Miss Carter is gone. All her things are still in her room, but her bed is empty. The guards are everywhere today." Harper kept her head down, vigorously scrubbing the metal pan. She knew exactly why Evelyn was missing. The realization that she had stood right in the middle of a deadly Mafia assassination plot made her feel nauseous. Suddenly, the heavy swinging doors of the kitchen burst open. The room fell into absolute, terrifying silence. Arthur Rossi marched into the room. The underboss was a tall, sharply dressed man with slicked-back dark hair and a permanent sneer. He was flanked by 4 heavily armed enforcers. Arthur's eyes darted around the room, looking frantic, anxious, and deeply confused. He had expected to receive news of Victor's sudden death hours ago. Instead, the estate was operating flawlessly, and his calls to Evelyn were going straight to voicemail. Arthur needed leverage, and he needed it instantly. His gaze swept over the terrified kitchen staff and locked directly onto Harper's wide, frightened eyes. A cruel smile stretched across his face. "Evans!" Arthur barked, his voice dripping with venom. He snapped his fingers. 2 of his men stepped forward, dragging a violently bruised and bloodied young man into the bright fluorescent light of the kitchen. Harper dropped the scouring pad. A horrifying scream tore from her throat. "Caleb!" Her younger brother fell to the tile floor, groaning in agony. His face was swollen. His ain't split and bleeding profusely. Harper rushed forward, her heavy body moving with desperate speed, and dropped to her knees beside him. She cradled his battered face in her trembling hands, completely ignoring the armed men surrounding them. "Caleb, oh my God, look at you," she sobbed, pressing her apron against his bleeding forehead. "Your brother's time is officially up, sweetheart," Arthur sneered, pulling a silver pistol from his shoulder holster and inspecting the barrel casually. "He owes me $60,000. Since you clearly cannot pay that debt, scrubbing pots, I am taking him to the docks. We are going to extract the payment in flesh." Harper threw her arms over her brother, shielding his broken body with her own immense bulk. "No, please! I signed the contract. I am working off the debt. You cannot take him." "Contracts change when I say they change," Arthur spat, stepping closer and aiming the weapon directly at Harper's head. The other maids screamed and scrambled backward, pressing themselves against the stainless steel refrigerators. "Move away from the boy, you fat cow, or I will put a bullet in you first." Harper squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the explosive impact. She hugged Caleb tighter, prepared to die right there on the cold kitchen floor. "You will not fire that weapon in my house, Arthur." The voice sliced through the chaotic kitchen like a razor-sharp sword. It was quiet, steady, and utterly terrifying. Arthur froze. He spun around, his face turning the color of ash. Victor Romano stood in the doorway. He looked magnificent, dangerous, and completely unscathed. He wore a crisp navy blue suit, his posture radiating absolute authority. Dominic Vargas and a dozen heavily armed Romano loyalists filed into the room behind him, instantly raising their automatic rifles and aiming them directly at Arthur and his men. "Victor," Arthur stammered, frantically lowering his pistol. Panic flooded his dark eyes. I was just collecting a debt from the servant. Standard business." Victor walked slowly into the room, his polished shoes clicking menacingly against the tile. He did not look at Arthur. His piercing cobalt eyes were fixed entirely on Harper, who was still kneeling on the floor, trembling violently as she shielded her brother. "Standard business," Victor repeated softly. He stopped just a few feet away from Arthur. "Like arranging a meeting with the Albanian cartel at the docks tonight. Like convincing my head housekeeper to pour neurotoxins into my evening glass of bourbon." Arthur's mouth dropped open. The color vanished completely from his lips. "Victor, listen to me. Those are lies." Before Arthur could finish the sentence, Victor moved with terrifying, lightning-fast precision. He grabbed the barrel of Arthur's pistol, twisted it violently upward, and drove his knee brutally into Arthur's stomach. As the underboss doubled over, Victor struck him across the jaw with the heavy steel grip of the gun. Arthur collapsed onto the floor, spitting blood and teeth. Dominic's men instantly disarmed Arthur's terrified guards, forcing them to their knees with weapons pressed firmly against the backs of their heads. Victor stood over the bleeding traitor. He tossed the confiscated pistol onto the nearby counter. "Take this trash to the warehouse," Victor ordered Dominic, his voice devoid of any mercy. "Make sure he stays awake for a very long time. I want the names of every single Albanian contact he spoke with before he stops breathing." Dominic grabbed Arthur by the collar, dragging the groaning, defeated man out of the kitchen. The remaining guards hauled Arthur's men away, leaving the kitchen completely silent, except for Caleb's ragged breathing. Victor slowly turned his attention back to Harper. She remained on the floor, her heart racing, her mind struggling to process the explosive violence she had just witnessed. She looked up at the terrifying Mafia boss, expecting him to direct his wrath toward her next. Instead, Victor did something that shocked every single person in the room. He knelt down on the dirty tile floor, ruining his incredibly expensive suit pants, and positioned himself directly in front of Harper. He reached out, his large, powerful hands gently grasping her trembling shoulders. "Are you injured?" he asked, his voice entirely transformed. The icy, ruthless tone was gone, replaced by a deep, genuine warmth that made Harper's breath catch in her throat. "No," Harper whispered, tears spilling over her eyelashes and tracking down her round cheeks. "I'm okay." "Please, Mr. Romano, my brother." Victor looked at Caleb, then gestured to Michael Sullivan, who was standing quietly near the door. Victor's directives for Caleb: call the private syndicate doctor immediately. Move the boy to a secure, comfortable guest suite in the West Wing. Provide round-the-clock protection until he is fully healed. Michael nodded and gently helped Caleb to his feet, guiding the injured boy out of the room. Harper stared at Victor in absolute disbelief. Why are you doing this?" Victor reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the physical contract Harper had signed months ago, the document that bound her to a life of miserable servitude. Holding her gaze, he slowly tore the thick parchment into tiny pieces, letting them flutter to the floor like snow. "The debt is entirely forgiven," Victor stated firmly, his intense gaze locking onto hers. "Arthur Rossi no longer exists in this world, and nobody will ever threaten your family again." He stood up, offering his hand to her. Harper hesitated, looking at his large, scarred palm. Slowly, she placed her small, calloused hand into his. He pulled her up with effortless strength, treating her heavy frame as though she weighed absolutely nothing. Victor turned to face the terrified kitchen staff. Samantha and the other maids were shaking, their eyes wide with shock as they witnessed the feared Don Romano holding the hand of the overweight, mocked cleaner. "Listen to me very carefully," Victor announced, his voice echoing with undeniable authority. "Harper Evans is no longer an employee of this estate. From this second forward, she is under my direct, personal protection. Anyone who disrespects her, anyone who mocks her, anyone who even looks at her with anything less than absolute reverence will answer directly to me. Is that completely understood?" A frantic chorus of "Yes, boss," and "Understood, Mr. Romano," echoed through the kitchen. Victor looked back down at Harper. He saw the profound confusion and overwhelming gratitude swirling in her beautiful, tear-filled eyes. He reached out, his thumb gently wiping away a stray tear from her cheek, perfectly mirroring the action she had taken for him the night before. "Come with me," Victor whispered softly, guiding her away from the harsh lights of the kitchen and toward the grand staircase. "We have a lot to discuss, Harper, and you are never scrubbing another floor as long as you live." The grand staircase of the Romano estate felt like a mountain. Harper Evans had climbed 1,000 times, hauling heavy vacuums and carrying baskets of dirty laundry. Today, ascending those same marble steps with her hand firmly encased in Victor's warm, powerful grip, the journey felt entirely different. The sneering faces of the other staff members faded into the background. For the first time in her life, Harper was not invisible. She was the absolute center of gravity. Victor led her past the guest quarters, bypassing the areas normally accessible to the household staff. They entered the restricted upper echelon of the mansion, a secluded wing guarded by heavy biometric security doors. The Don pressed his thumb against a glowing scanner. The thick steel door hissed open, revealing a breathtaking penthouse suite overlooking the roaring Hudson River. Floor-to-ceiling windows bathed the enormous room in natural sunlight. Rich mahogany furniture, deep leather sofas, and an impossibly massive king-sized bed dominated the space. A staggering collection of rare first-edition books lined the walls. "Sit," Victor instructed gently, guiding her toward a plush velvet armchair near the window. Harper remained standing, her fingers nervously twisting the cheap, stiff fabric of her grey uniform. Her chest heaved with anxious breaths. She looked around the immaculate room, terrified her dusty shoes might ruin the pristine, cream-colored Persian rug. "Mr. Romano, I do not belong in a place like this," Harper whispered, her eyes darting toward the exit. "My brother is safe now. The debt is gone. You owe me absolutely nothing. Please allow me to pack my few belongings and leave the estate. I will take Caleb far away from New York." Victor walked over to a crystal decanter, pouring a small glass of sparkling water and handing it to her. His piercing cobalt eyes locked onto hers, stripping away all her defenses. "You are mistaken, Harper," Victor replied softly, leaning against the edge of his massive desk. "I owe you my life. You possess a spirit rarer than any diamond locked in my vaults. I am not letting you walk out of those gates." Harper shook her head, a bitter, self-deprecating laugh escaping her lips. "Look at me, boss. Truly look at me. I am a morbidly obese maid. The women you associate with are supermodels, heiresses, and politicians. They wear Prada and weigh 100 pounds. If your syndicate sees you keeping a woman like me in your private quarters, they will laugh at you. They will think you have lost your mind." Victor's jaw tightened. A flash of dangerous anger crossed his features, not directed at her, but at the cruel society that had systematically destroyed her self-worth. He closed the distance between them, cupping her soft, round face in his large hands. "Let them laugh," Victor murmured, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. "Any man foolish enough to mock the woman I choose will lose his tongue. You think your size repulses me? You think I desire the hollow, venomous women who seek my money?" He stepped closer, his chest brushing against hers. "Last night I took a heavy dose of a paralytic drug," Victor confessed, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "I set a trap to find the rat in my house. My muscles were completely frozen, but my mind was fully awake. I heard exactly how Evelyn spoke to me. I saw the poison she poured into my glass. And then I saw you." Harper's eyes widened in absolute shock. The glass of water trembled in her hand. You were awake?" "I felt the warm cloth you used to clean my hands," Victor continued, his gaze unwavering. "I heard the beautiful, honest words you spoke. You saw a monster bleeding, and you offered him peace, You shielded me when I was entirely defenseless. Your heart, Harper, is a fortress. Your body is the beautiful temple housing that magnificent heart. I cherish every single inch of you." Tears streamed freely down Harper's face. Nobody had ever spoken to her with such fierce, protective devotion. The walls she had built around herself, the physical weight, the silence, the constant submission, began to crack under the overwhelming weight of his affection. Victor's immediate decrees for the estate. Harper Evans is completely relieved of all physical labor. The master suite is her permanent new residence. A team of private tailors from Manhattan will arrive by afternoon to design custom clothing fitting her precise measurements. For the next several hours, Harper lived in a surreal dream. Professional stylists, sworn to absolute secrecy by Dominic Vargas, arrived at the estate. They treated Harper with a level of reverence she had never experienced. They measured her curves, complimenting her soft skin and rich, thick hair. By evening, the drab grey uniform was incinerated. Harper stood before a full-length mirror, wearing a breathtaking emerald-green silk gown that draped beautifully over her heavy frame, accentuating her waist and highlighting the natural flush in her cheeks. When Victor walked into the room, he stopped dead in his tracks. The ruthless Mafia boss looked at her with such raw, unfiltered hunger and adoration that Harper's knees felt weak. They shared a private dinner on the balcony, eating exquisite dishes prepared by a renowned chef brought in specifically from Carbone in the city. Victor asked her about her childhood, her dreams, and her relentless struggle to protect Caleb. He listened intently, treating her words like gospel. However, the tranquility of the evening was a fragile illusion. The Romano Empire was built on blood, and blood always demanded a final payment. At exactly 11:45 p.m., the peaceful silence of the estate shattered. A massive explosion rattled the reinforced glass of the penthouse windows. The entire mansion violently shook. The emergency alarms began screaming, bathing the luxurious suite in a flashing, sinister red light. Victor was instantly on his feet, his romantic demeanor vanishing, replaced immediately by the cold, calculating mind of a cartel warlord. He pulled a heavy tactical vest from a hidden compartment behind the bookshelf and grabbed a suppressed submachine gun. Dominic's voice crackled through the secure intercom system. "Boss, the western perimeter is breached. Arthur Rossi left a delayed backdoor code in the security mainframe before we detained him. The Albanians sent a massive hit squad. They bypassed the main gate. We have heavy casualties on the lawn. They are inside the mansion." "Lock down the penthouse," Victor commanded, chambering around. "Protect the main stairwell. Eliminate any unauthorized targets." Victor turned to Harper. "Get inside the panic room behind the closet. The walls are reinforced steel. Do not come out until I personally open the door," called. Harper's heart hammered against her ribs, but her mind raced with terrifying clarity. "Caleb. He is recovering in the guest suite on the 2nd floor. He cannot walk, Victor. They will slaughter him." Victor cursed under his breath. The guest suite was on the lower level, directly in the path of the invading Albanian forces. Going down the main stairwell meant walking into a storm of heavy gunfire. "I will send Dominic's men to extract him," Victor said, grabbing her shoulders. "You must stay here." "No!" Harper shouted, her voice echoing with sudden, fierce authority. She grabbed the fabric of his dark shirt. "Your men do not know the hidden service corridors. Evelyn kept those blueprints secret from the guards to hide her stolen goods. The main stairs are a death trap, but I know the exact layout of the walls. I can get us to Caleb's room completely unseen." Victor stared at her. The maid's invisible network of narrow hallways, used to move laundry and supplies without disturbing the guests. bypassed the entire grand foyer. Harper's years of scrubbing this massive fortress had mapped every single hidden artery of the building into her brain. "Lead the way," Victor ordered, placing his absolute trust in her. Harper kicked off her high heels, gripping the skirt of her emerald gown, and sprinted toward the east wall of the suite. She pressed a concealed panel hidden behind a large Renaissance painting. A narrow, dark corridor opened. They moved quickly through the suffocating darkness. The sounds of chaotic gunfire and screaming men echoed through the plaster walls. But the hidden corridor remained completely empty. Harper navigated the twists and turns with expert precision, her heavy breathing filling the silence. She was no longer a victim. She was the vital navigator saving her family. They reached a small service door that opened directly behind the closet in Caleb's guest suite. Harper pushed it open and tumbled into the room. Caleb was desperately trying to crawl off the bed, his bruised face pale with terror as boots pounded down the hallway outside his door. "Harper!" Caleb cried out. "I have you," she whispered fiercely, rushing to his side and pulling his arm over her shoulder. Victor stepped out of the hidden passage behind her, his weapon raised, his eyes scanning the doorway. Suddenly, the heavy oak door of the bedroom exploded inward in a shower of wooden splinters. 3 heavily armed Albanian mercenaries rushed into the room, their assault rifles raised. Victor did not hesitate. He moved with terrifying, lethal grace. The suppressed weapon in his hands coughed quietly, spitting a deadly stream of bullets. 2 mercenaries dropped instantly, their armor pierced. The 3rd mercenary managed to fire a wild burst, the bullets tearing into the drywall mere inches from Harper's head. With a feral roar, Victor dropped his empty weapon, drew a heavy combat knife, and lunged across the room. He tackled the final mercenary, burying the blade deep into the man's chest. Silence fell over the room, broken only by the distant sounds of Dominic's men, mopping up the remaining attackers in the courtyard. Victor stood up, his white dress shirt speckled with blood. He looked frantically at Harper and Caleb. "Are you harmed?" Victor demanded, rushing to her side and checking her for injuries. "We are safe," Harper breathed, pulling Caleb tightly against her. She looked at the bodies on the floor, then up at the formidable Don. "Because of you?" Victor shook his head, pressing his forehead gently against hers. "Because of you, Harper. You navigated the darkness. You saved us." The following morning, the Romano estate resembled a war zone, but the empire remained entirely intact. The Albanian hit squad was completely eradicated. Arthur Rossi had provided the names of all his co-conspirators before meeting his brutal end at the docks. The syndicate was purged of all its poison. Victor called a mandatory meeting in the grand dining room. Dozens of highly ranked capos, lieutenants, and enforcers gathered around the massive mahogany table. The men spoke in hushed, nervous tones, waiting for their ruthless leader to address the violent events of the night. The heavy doors opened. Victor walked into the room, his presence instantly silencing the crowd. However, he did not walk alone. By his side walked Harper Evans. She wore a stunning tailored dress, her head held high. The timid, invisible Maid was gone. In her place stood a woman of immense strength, a survivor who had navigated the deadliest night in the syndicate's history with absolute courage. Several men exchanged confused glances. A few recognized the former cleaning woman, their faces contorting in silent disbelief. Victor guided Harper to the head of the table. He pulled out the ornate, high-backed chair directly to the right of his own, a seat traditionally reserved for the underboss. "Sit, my dear," Victor instructed softly. Harper sat down, her posture perfect, her gaze steady as she looked out at the most dangerous men in New York. Victor turned to face his soldiers. His cobalt eyes were cold, commanding absolute obedience. "Our family survived a massive betrayal yesterday," Victor announced, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "Men I trusted for years tried to burn this empire to ashes. They valued greed over loyalty. They prioritized superficial power over genuine strength." He rested his hand gently on Harper's shoulder. "This woman stood in the center of the storm," Victor continued, his tone filled with undeniable pride. "She disposed of the poison meant for my glass. She guided me through the darkness to save her family. She demonstrated more bravery and honor in a single night than most men in this room have shown in a lifetime." Victor looked around the table, ensuring every single man understood his next words perfectly. "The era of hiding our true strength is over. Harper Evans is my partner in all things. She holds my absolute trust, my heart, and my authority. Anyone who disrespects her will face a punishment far worse than death. She is the queen of this syndicate." Nobody dared to speak a single word of dissent. Dominic Vargas, standing near the door, slowly bowed his head in deep respect. One by one, the lethal capos and hardened criminals around the table followed suit, lowering their heads in complete submission to the new matriarch of the Romano family. Harper looked up at Victor. He smiled softly, a genuine, unguarded expression reserved entirely for her. She reached up and placed her hand over his. She was no longer hiding behind a shapeless gray uniform. She had conquered the shadows, tamed the monster, and claimed her rightful place on the throne. If you loved this emotional Mafia romance and want to see how Victor takes his ruthless revenge while claiming his unlikely queen, hit that like button right now. Share this story with your friends who love drama, tension, and a fierce, unexpected romance. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss the next thrilling part of Victor and Harper's journey. Drop a comment below, telling us your favorite moment from the story.